Now is the time for questions, and I am going to ask you to formulate your question as loud as you can because of the distance in the room.
And because I tend to be hearing impaired as well.
My name is Harold Hoen. I hold a chair in international political economy. And thank you for your fascinating lecture. I'm really impressed. My question relates to a possible difference between a micro and a macro level. And I was wondering whether you could comment on that. At a micro level, and the examples you've given in factories, I would think that Fordism is based on a link between routine and rational behavior. At a macro level, I'm not sure about that. If you would look at, if you have a look at political economy and would look at, let's say, mainstream thought, it's all about equilibrium thinking, and time is not so much included in, let's say, mainstream economics at the macro level, not in a historical sense at least, maybe in a logical sense. And that might be due to the equilibrium concept. If you look at alternative theory, you see that there's a complete distinction between routine behavior and rational choice. Let's say if you look at Austrian economics, you would say, well, it's not an instantaneous jump from one equilibrium to the other in which you neglect time, but it's an ongoing process of not well-informed actors that just try and to make the best of it, creatively destructing the world in that sense and heading towards a new equilibrium, but never reaching it. Would you agree on that distinct perception on micro and level and macro level, or would you say that's utter nonsense?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in much of my work, I try to distinguish between the level I call the macro political level, and that is the system of policy that organizes the rhythms for bodies, and the micro political level in which people try to cope, as it were, with the system in which they find themselves. And one of the things that interests me is what I would call kind of a corporeal gestural economy, which resists the macro economy within which people find themselves coerced in one way or another. And what I've been looking for is the way in which the arts can provide us a model by which we can perceive those instances in which the micro level of resistance is taking place. And that's why, among other things, I've turned to documentary cinema, which is beginning to show the consequences of the macro policy and the challenging responses that take place.
Thank you so much.
Federica?
Good day, I'm a lecturer here. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I have a question concerning your idea about dance as being something that could be subversive. And I would like, I'm struggling to grasp when dance is or can be subversive and when it might not be subversive. And I'm coming from the backdrop of having had a look at congresses in history. And what I saw is that the choreography is very much standardized and linked to the knowledge holder and the truth holder, basically. And changes also how congresses are done, for instance, choreographically, and what is possible and what would be considered subversive in that context. And from there, from against this backdrop, I'm raising the question because I realized that in the examples that you gave us, and also you mentioned that a contagious setting must be given somehow. So to say that it's not only one person dancing, but in the end, basically an association of dancers.
Yeah, there's a resonance going on in which the movements of one begin to affect the movements of another. Yeah.
Exactly, and I wanted just to ask you whether you could elaborate on that a little bit more when dance is or can be subversive, considering that, for instance, expressive dance today could be considered maybe an expression linked to the knowledge holder.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important question, and the first thing I would suggest is that the grammar that you're using is important here. One question always is, what is dance, right? And then you get these formulaic answers. But when you ask the question, when is dance, then you're dealing not simply with the way in which society organizes itself in some organic way, but you're thinking in terms of events, moments that are somehow subversive. And as you're speaking, one of the things I think about is, I quoted briefly from Randy Martin, an old friend who unfortunately died of a brain tumor at age 57 a couple of years ago. But he was a dance theorist, and he was looking precisely for what are those places and moments in which you get a kind of subversive gesture. And he chose skateboarding, among other things, which really struck me because I spent a month or so in Helsinki a couple of summers ago. And I noticed that the sounds of the city was clack, 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 clack. There was so much skateboarding going on all the time. And it was going on in parallel while you saw other people rapidly moving from their lunch to their work and back to lunch again, to the evening and so forth. So you had the sort of the choreography of the world of work, and then you had a subversive choreography going on throughout the city. And so when was almost at almost any moment, basically. And certainly in the process of skateboarding, someone will invent a particular move and someone else will try to reproduce it and so forth. And it was one of those kinds of dynamics of movement that seemed not suborned by the system that was going on. But yeah, I think part of the wisdom is asking when and thinking in terms of events. Yeah, Ben.
Thanks for an excellent talk. Very much along the lines of your discussion of rhythm, when in 1871 the revolutionaries of the Paris Commune smashed the clocks, they were revolting against the symbol of a unified system that was expressive of that which had to be changed.
Yeah.
And when we use the language of exploitation, when we use the language of a relative position within the value chain, there seemed to be some reminiscence of that vocabulary. And maybe even the idea of there being something like a unified system, which is the target of critique. And I was wondering whether you could maybe briefly elaborate on that figure, which clearly you would not endorse as a concept of the system, but which nevertheless seems to be at play in these subversive choreographies that you were talking about.
It's a really complicated apparatus because along with aspects of temporality is the grammar with which we describe it, right? Well, there's a terrific moment in Thomas Pynchon's novel Mason and Dixon. There's a conversation in an English pub because they've just learned that the head astronomer has removed 11 days from the calendar. And they're talking about how one could possibly put up with that. And one says, it would have to be people with no verbs in their language, for example. Right? So it's a really complicated set of relationships going on. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking is did some work on American political thought, and I studied a lot about Thomas Jefferson. And one of the things I ran into was an as told to book by someone named Isaac Jefferson, a slave who could not write, but someone wrote down what he said. And there was an amazing line in there and said that Mr. Jefferson never came into the kitchen except to wind the clock. In other words, the Jefferson Gulag was basically organized around Jeffersonian time. When he took a crap, when he went for a horseback ride, when he had guests and so forth, and everybody else was more or less forced to operate around that. You know.
Hi, I'm Ariana, PhD candidate at the Department of IRIO. I really liked your talk. Thank you so much. And it's a question, but also maybe a comment. What struck me is that you're engaging with art and showing how art can be subversive, and at the same time how art can actually govern. This reminded me the subject of dance and political authority and maintaining a particular political authority. In the case of the Islamic Republic, where dance as an expression is actually forbidden, and where the subversive act of dance is itself actually challenging the authority of the state. And so perhaps you can even further actually expand your project from sweatshops
moving into
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
the political authority of a particular group within a particular system.
Yeah.
So I really liked it and gave me a lot of ideas.
One of the concepts that I've used in the past is the concept of cultural governance. You know, the state frequently suborns the arts for various reasons, like the French Grand Opera was created, among other things, to invite the people into the nation, right? That was the purpose, right? To sort of solidify political allegiance. And the National Theatre in England was similarly organized. And so on the one hand, there's cultural governance, on the other hand, there's cultural practices which operate, I guess you could call it, in the civic sphere, that are outside what is controlled by governance. And so that clash of cultural governance on the one hand and the civic sphere on the other, and it comes to a head in various kinds of controversies. I'm thinking of Rudy Giuliani's trying to cut off money to the Brooklyn Museum when they had a particular exhibition of someone who had, I guess, a picture of the Virgin Mary with elephant shit on it and so forth and so on. And so he tried to cut that off because he felt it was, you know, a subversive kind of art. And in response to that, Judith Butler wrote a terrific piece called The Value of Being Disturbed, right? To look at what rises out of the civic sphere.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Senka, and I'm also lecturing here at Brook. I have a question which kind of follows up on Benjamin's question, and that's regarding Peter Weiss wrote a book.
Regarding the...
Sorry. Peter Weiss wrote a book, Aesthetics of Resistance.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I think it was 89, and it was quite recently, relatively recently translated. And I was wondering whether you can talk about this performance or language of resistance vis-a-vis the last sentence that you said of your talk.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
If you could talk about this aesthetics of resistance in connection to the academia, because I was quite struck by your last sentence in the talk about the role of the academia in the whole process. But if we go back to Peter Weiss, it's precisely if we would speak the language, or if we are to talk about this, then the whole point is gone.
Well, there's so many different ways to talk about it. One of the concepts that I like to think about is the way Deleuze and Guattari talk about lines of flight, and that is ways of thinking and moving outside of the order words within which the university is organized or within which a particular disciplinary is organized. And so, for example, when lots of academics think they're being creative when they want to engage in interdisciplinary work, and that is consolidating two disciplines like sociology and art history and making them work together, where I think I prefer the concept that Jacques Rancière uses, goes indisciplinarity, by which he means those gestures which break disciplines rather than reinforce them. Right? And so much, it's so difficult because in addition to the idea system we're thinking about, there's a political economy of disciplines going on constantly which consolidate them. It becomes very hard for somebody to operate outside of their focus because they become ungrammatical, you know, within the particular way they work. And so on the one hand, it's a linguistic problem. It's seeking lines of flight, speaking in ways that subvert the order words which things are ordinarily done, but also creating lines of interactivity where people can renegotiate their relationship. One of the things I've looked at recently, which for me was sort of really provocative, is a book called Civic Jazz. And it focuses basically on the way a jazz ensemble creates an event of common sense as opposed to this organic structure in which we think we have the same sense of what's going on. And so I began to look at episodes of it. I Googled YouTube again and picked up a Marcus Roberts ensemble. Right? Marcus Roberts is playing a relatively familiar tune, but in its kind of a dissonant way. And then the bass says, I think I know what you want to talk about, and he begins to play in a particular way, and Marcus Roberts begins to change how he's thinking about it. And then finally the drummer does the same thing. And pretty soon this musical event basically is a renegotiation of sense. It's a new community of sense. And so one of the things I would say about academia is it's an ecology of music, of of sense, of communities of sense, a different ecology of them, right? And that ecology tends to be fixed by a whole variety of authoritative practices, and those have to be broken down for people to begin to renegotiate different kinds of relationships. And as I was saying before, I think it's always better to think of meaning as a series of events rather than something that comes out of a well-structured, institutionalized base. What are the events by which we suddenly begin to change how we relate to each other, who we are, etc.
I've got yep, and then.
Okay, thanks. I'm puzzled by one aspect. Dance is normally associated with positive connotations like joy, pleasure, and how do they figure in your analysis? Because is it only misuse of these things when you are using rhythms for disciplining, or do they have a status at all in the way you conceptualize this?
I wasn't thinking of it in terms of pleasureful or not. I was thinking of it in terms of the extent to which one orients one's bodies to one's own determinations. Right? The most extreme model, for example, for not having any kind of control over your body, I saw a film on the way in which young women are taught to do Javanese dancing. The music is turned on, the instructor holds the child and begins to move their hands and so forth. And then pretty soon they let go, and the music can go on later on, and the child will make those exact movements because their brain has been trained. If you break down the relationship, the body is part of the brain. The brain has been trained to move in a particular way. And so I'm interested in those instances in which there's a form of spontaneity by which people try to sort of break out of the gestural economy within which they've been controlled, and in a way that is contagious, as was going on here in the factory. And it looked like people were enjoying themselves, but what was enjoyable was that for this moment they were no longer sort of extensions of their machines.
Why then use the term dance for it rather than rhythmic disciplining or terms with other connotations?
Well, you could.
Yeah.
I think dance is a nice way to consolidate it, but it's not I'm not wedded to that necessarily. You know.
I understand you could, but you didn't. So.
I think that the more general term would be gestural, certainly. Yeah. And it's certainly the case that when the social order is, among other things, an economy of gestures and an exchange of gestures. Just to give you an example, if I'm walking across campus and I notice that I'm walking in exactly the opposite direction that I should be, before I turn around and just do this, I usually go through a charade of some sort. I go like this or I go like that, just to tell the world that I'm not some idiot that would change direction for no good reason. I'm indicating that I'm a reasonable person, and I assume that people are watching me to some extent, and so my gestures are attuned to this kind of social communication. And certainly that's broader than dance. You know. I just found that as I got into the problem that Fanon suggests and began to pursue it, it was people who regarded themselves as dance theorists who were providing a nice kind of frame of reference for me.
A rather simple question.
Can you tell us who you are first?
Sorry, yeah, my name is Toby. I'm a IR student.
Oh, great.
And I'm a relatively young student. I just switched my major from psychology to IR. And I wonder and want to ask you, how can you advance in academia? It's related to this, I read your talk in theory talks about interdisciplinarity.
Oh, right, okay.
I wonder how you can advance in academia when you have to reproduce the institutional requirements to be productive. Mm-hmm. So to get to this position where you can break disciplines, you have to reproduce disciplines. Mm. And how do I cope with this as a young student who, I don't want to follow the disciplines, but I have to get to this position. Mm-hmm. It's a paradox.
Well, I have a similar problem. When I write for a social science journal, they can't figure out why I'm talking about so many different things. It doesn't make sense to them because they have a relatively fixed protocol. They want a lot of meta talk I'm supposed to at the beginning say, what I'm about to do is this, and I'm going to do it in this way. And then I have to signal partway through, here I am doing it. And then by the end I have to say, let me explain what I've just done. And my desire is not to engage in that kind of meta-talk. I'd like to think through juxtapositions, as it were. In fact, I was trying to, I'll get back to your question, but I can't help reflecting on it. I was trying to figure out how I could possibly describe my method. And I had this fantasy that I'm standing on one side of a river and there are a bunch of rocks that are just above the surface. And it's a rapid river, and to get across to the other side, I have to jump from one rock to the other, as it were. What are those rocks? Those are the various forms of conceptualization that I use to tie things together. They're texts. I begin to think through a problem with this text, and then another text occurs to me and I jump to that one. And certainly there are probably many different rocks and I could have crossed the river in different ways, right? But that's what I seem to be doing. So for example, I sent something to a journal which ultimately they accepted happily, but one of the readers said the author should justify why he chose those particular films. And I said to the editors, it goes without saying that I could have made the argument with other films, so I'm going to let it go without saying, as it were. And so here's the problem, certainly, that on the one hand you want to invent a new way of thinking, but on the other hand you have to apprise your audience about what it is that makes this way of thinking valuable. And so you have to somehow work on it, as it were. My work on it was constituted by writing a text which I called Studies in Transdisciplinary Method, in which I talk about how one can regard the way one writes as part and parcel of the analysis, for example, and how one can work without meta-talk. And I look for various examples to help justify that, one of whom is Walter Benjamin, who talked about his method as literary montage. I don't explain, I show. Right? But yeah, it's a problem. And when I encourage students to think this way, I sometimes think that I'm disabling them, right? Because I'm putting them in a position where it's going to be hard for them to get things accepted. But if enough people begin to think this way and begin to do that work, you find that there is a kind of subversive or smaller community of workers. In fact, one of the things you can say about academia is that it's an ecology of textual communities. Right? People who read the similar kinds of stuff and are inspired by them, and they interact with each other. And one of the problems frequently is to get a particular textual community some structure of recognition. And one of the ways that I and some other people have done it is to start a new journal called Theory and Event, in which there's hospitality to that particular way of working. So sometimes you have to invent a new institutional form to make it work.
Like on that particular point, can you also say something about the costs incurred in doing such kind of scholarship?
Talk about, say it again?
The costs incurred in doing such kind of scholarship.
Well, yeah, a lot of people pay a high price for it. Penn State, for example, decided that political theory, political philosophy was subversive to empirical work, and so they cut out that part of the curriculum. And the one theorist, PhD student that was left, was funded to go to a meeting, but he was told that he could only use those funds if he didn't tell anybody he came from Penn State. Right? I mean, that's how severe the policing is sometimes that's going on. And so, yeah, there's a lot of policing going on because for some reason, some people who do a particular kind of work feel that they have to, well, they're fanatics in the sense that they feel that other people have to valorize that particular kind of work and valorize nothing else, as it were. It's kind of the academic version of ISIS.
Just as old.
Any more questions? Please.
Yeah.
I'm Jacob. I'm also an IR student, and I wanted to ask, do you think that students can be...
Oh, a bit louder, please.
Can students even be in the position to try to change those systems that you were talking about, like in academia, or would we kind of fail if we try? Would we get thrown out of university?
Well, it's hard to generalize, but there are a lot of horror stories out there about people who try to operate in a different way and find that they're unable to get a dissertation accepted, for example. But then there are good examples of people starting new movements. There's a journal called The New Political Science, for example, that was begun by a bunch of people who felt that mainstream political science was insufficiently attentive to a variety of forms of political consciousness. And so one of the things you can find, I think, almost no matter what kind of work you do, you'll find some small aspect of academia that's hospitable to it. Right? Now, if you work in if you're doing a degree in a department that has nobody that's hospitable to what you want to do, you're stuck. You have to go somewhere else. Right?
That won't happen. Any more questions? Well, in that case, before we thank Mike, there is a seminar tomorrow to which some of you have signed up. If anybody still wants to attend, we might be able to open up some spaces, particularly for the students. So do let me know after we thank Mike. So, Mike, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you very much for delivering a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
You're always welcome to come back.
Thank you for the opportunity.